Hello, everybody. So last time you were with me, when we were doing the Bible studies, we went through Genesis, and this one's not going to be any different. We're still going through the Torah, and we're going to go through Exodus. So, uh, bear with me through this podcast, and hopefully, you're going to learn something and get something out of this. And, anyways, we're going to start this, and hopefully, you enjoy it. So, here we go. I'm going to put this here, set this right here. All right. All right. So, introduction to Exodus. This Bible series on Exodus, this is the introduction. So, we're going to start on chapter 1 next time. So, this Bible series on Exodus is going to aim to look at the books through a Second Temple, Jewish, and early Christian lens. Well, usually we're going to use a Septuagint instead of the Masoretic because it's older. And the writings of the New Testament hardly use Masoretic textual variants when they quote anything from the Old Testament or the apocryphal text for that matter. Any Bible will do to follow along, but I will be using the Orthodox Study Bible. So that's the one I'm going to use. The Torah or the Pentateuch are the 5 books that from the very start of Judaism were seen as being part of a unit. The Pentateuch, meaning 5 scrolls, consist of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Torah is Hebrew for teaching, to teach, to guide. A lot of people commonly accept it to mean law, and that's because in Greek, Torah is often translated to nomos, which has often been in English turned into law. However, the Torah nomos teaching of the Hebrew people is much more than just laws and commandments to follow. The Torah also it's also a guide in culture and its way of life. The Torah is good, and God, Yahweh, is teaching to humanity. For Latin speakers, the Hebrew Torah and the Greek nomos became in Latin lex, and after the 5th century, the term lex shifted in meaning around St. Jerome's time period to be less about culture, etc., and more about just laws. So this is why in the West we often focus on it in the manner most are used to in a civil law and law in a general context. So Torah is more than just the commandments of God, though. God can teach and guide us through stories and records of how he interacted with people. And in Genesis, we found that mostly, and now we're going to see that happening in Exodus as well. So, who wrote the Torah? Well, Moses is traditionally seen as a writer, but this is obviously a loose definition here since we find very clearly that someone else wrote the ending of Deuteronomy since it records Moses' death in it. And being part of Egyptian royalty, Moses would be very literate and in multiple languages and be able to do multiple languages. So tradition is that Moses wrote the original Torah and that someone else wrote with Moses and added Moses' death, and the scribes over time edited but preserved Torah for us. Exodus 15 and Deuteronomy 32, for example, show us this is probably the case because they were in a very ancient Hebrew, enough that it's hard for most to translate it today. Someone definitely edited Genesis because it even tells us someone did Exodus as well. This tradition is authoritative. Who edited the Torah? While we cannot be conclusive with this, I will argue that it was Ezra the scribe, as traditionally he is the editor of Torah. And so a lot of times when we get to like parts about the editor, I'm going to call it Ezra. I'm going to just say it's Ezra, okay? And there are debates about it, but this is to simplify it because this is a Bible study. So, I'm going to say that to be simplified with it. So in the Greek, the Exodus in Greek means the way or the road out. So that's what that means. For some context, the Hyksos era lasted roughly 1650 to 1550 BC. The traditional dating of the Exodus is usually between the 15th and 13th century BC. As we talked about with Genesis, Torah functions as a unit. Genesis was the prologue, but Exodus to Deuteronomy begins a whole different arc, and that arc is the life of St. Moses primarily, ending with his death. These books, though, have quite varied material going on in them. In Exodus, for example, we'll go through a lot of the narrative, which is very similar to Genesis with its patriarchal narrative. Unlike Genesis, though, we're going to have things like lists of commandments. All of Genesis was a prologue that was there to serve and set up the rest of the Torah. Exodus is the story proper, whereas Genesis is the prologue to this story. So Exodus picks up centuries from where we left off with Joseph dying in Genesis. So a gap of centuries has passed since then. So one of the questions that's going to probably come up, what date was Exodus written in? If Abraham was around 2000 BC, then most would date the Exodus to be written around, say, the 15th century BC or 1400 BCE to the 13th century BCE. Problem is, though, neither date given here is based on archaeology nor anything outside the Bible. So the truth is that most of, quote, biblical scholarship historically comes from Protestantism. So this dating debate exists on a liberal conservative spectrum. And all of this is coming from a modernist spectrum of thinking. All of these sides are mostly working from a paradigm and a basis of a pseudoscientific definition of history. So on the conservative spectrum of it, you'll have them claim that, no, we will prove all the stuff in the Bible happened exactly like this. And they will tell you precise statements of when and how it happened, etc. The liberal spectrum, though, will go, well, it didn't happen that way. And they'll use what's called legerdemain, it's a German word, to tell you what really happened or what's behind the text. Neither of these approaches have borne any good fruit. Well, they've borne some good fruit, but they haven't borne that good of fruit. So, for example, the liberal side, the most common view now in Old Testament scholarship, so think like Society of Biblical Literature, is that in their understanding, the Exodus and Joshua's conquest did not happen at all like the Bible claims. They'll claim, though, often that there was a small group of escaped slaves who left Egypt, went to Canaan, and discovered oppressed working people toiling under their Canaanite overlords and self-proclaimed god kings. And these escaped slaves radicalized these people and led a class slave revolt, and then they created the nation of Israel. This is a standard historical reconstruction that often goes on. Conservatives then will do likewise, as I'll show shortly. Certain parties want to prove and really prove that certain things in the Bible are true or aren't, and do so for various political and contemporary reasons. One must ask, however, why should we trust one's reconstruction over another's? Aren't we just giving a story or, quote, history based on a presupposition doing it that way? I would argue yes. So the conservative side, we just talked about the liberal side, conservative side is not exempt from the critique here. They have a reconstruction too. That is, quote, for the Bible to be true, it has to have happened on this date and this way, end quote. They will use whatever they can as evidence, quote unquote, and then force it to fit because the Bible has to be true because of my modernist presuppositions, right? So the conservative side is potentially worse than the liberal side because it has created an entire subspecies of literature that is just out there to, quote, prove the Bible is true and try, or sometimes to try to debunk the Bible. Both are modernist frameworks that are just not the best lens to interpret Exodus, though. A very literal and fundamentalist reading is not wise, and neither is an extremely loose reading lens, the opposite of fundamentalism. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is that whatever God wanted and has to say here in Torah, well, the date's not really relevant at the end of the day. And that also is not the purpose of the Torah here either. All of this speculation can actually become a distraction. Just as it was for Genesis, this isn't the goal Exodus is trying for. The date and the time, etc., these are all distractions to distract one from the Exodus main goal it is trying to achieve and give the reader. Remember that, so like Greek and Hebrew numbers, as we said in Genesis study, they're not very precise. So oftentimes trying to map history or, for example, from 2 Kings and the date it gives, really difficult since the Greek and Hebrew all do say and give different number variants. And the truth is, there isn't a solid evidence that can be given to back up Exodus having happened definitively in the 15th century or 13th century BC. So if they tell you that, like, there's not actually definitive evidence for either one of those dates, right? Another big issue is that academics have had to revise the chronology of ancient Egypt. So unfortunately, the ancient world's chronology is not as static as we would like it to be. The records that we do have, though, are usually isolated records from isolated places. Another issue is that around 1000 BC, after the Bronze Age collapse, we have more communication and better record keeping. But before that, we don't have complete records, and we are often left with conjecture. It's hard to reconstruct all of this. So that's a big problem. So, like Egypt, for example, the most people once thought that they had quite a solid chronology, but now historians and archaeologists and academia have had to revise it because they found they were off on some things by around 100 to 200 more years. So, because of this, it can also shift the potential dating of Exodus, right? So, what could the date really be? Could it be 16th century BC for Exodus? We've found some potential things in the 16th century BC, but it isn't definitive. And the consensus of those quote scholars that we talked about earlier, they don't really want to use it from either spectrum because that messes up even more of their presuppositions and Bible dates. So it's all a very large mess. So what is this evidence? It's poetry on tablets speaking of cataclysms in Egypt. Darkness at noon mentions. Could it be the date? Maybe. But I don't think anyone should die on the hill for any of these positions, actually. And I would argue don't argue for those positions. Just like that's not the point. So just like I did with Genesis. So here's another question. Did Moses even exist? Well, I'm going to say yes. Those who argue otherwise should be asked, is there actually any proof that anyone really can be proven to have existed before 400 to 500 AD? It's actually pretty difficult. The arguments modernists make about it are usually pretty dumb, like proving Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great really existed and did everything described about them, proving these things really happened. Good luck, because we can't. It's hard to. It's very hard to. And I do believe those people existed, by the way, but it's kind of that way though. Like, yeah, it's really hard to prove that. Well, that definitively happened, right? But we do have these writings. So yeah. Anyways, so the first mention that we get of Israel, the nation, is from the Meneptah stele, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, which says Pharaoh claims victory over Israel in 1213 to 1203 BC. It says of Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. Some critics try to claim that the name Yahweh was not used as a name for God before Genesis, but this is wrong and anachronistic. No one thought God had only one name either. Even the pagans accepted that the gods have more than one name. The God of the Israelites has a ton of names as well, and they are used multiple times, periods, and places. This doesn't mean Israelites believed in different gods or that the traditions that these names come up with are from hundreds of years apart either, like some modernist scholarship attempts to argue. Yahweh itself is actually a third-person singular verb. He who, not I. Yahweh is a conjugated form of Haya, which means to be or to exist. And the verb is used as a noun as well, but it is not actually I am, like many claim. Hebrew language, strictly speaking, has two tenses, and those tenses have no relevance when it comes to time. So it's not like English. English functions are based on verb tenses, and those verb tenses are related to time. Hebrew is also a binomial system, so you take a verb and you change it. So the title Yahweh is talking about God's creative power. Who God is the one who takes things that are not and causes them to be. So when God tells Moses, for example, that, quote, your forefathers knew me as God, but they didn't yet know me as he who causes things to be or exist, end quote, he is telling Moses about an experience he's about to have. And when that happens, then they will know I am Yahweh when this happens. So that's what he's actually saying. We also find the name Yahu in the 14th century BC, which is an Egyptianized shortened term for the name Yahweh, the god of the Shazu or the Sho's Bedouins. This is the earliest known mention of Yahweh we have, which is found in Egyptian inscriptions. So who are the Shazu? This name the Egyptians called them, but the Bible calls them the Edomites and the Midianites. So remember how I told you guys in Genesis that Esau and Ishmael are not the bad guys? Well, here's one of the reasons why. Esau and Ishmael's descendants, as we can see, they worship Yahweh. these are the people Moses is said to have lived with for a long time too. So there you go. Exodus is the Greek name for the book, which means the departing or leaving. The Hebrew name for the book is Shemot, or names, book of names. The background of Torah and Exodus. So regardless of the potential dating, Exodus is either entering the Bronze Age collapse period, or that period has already begun. So around the 16th or 15th century, it had already begun, and by the 13th and 12th century BC, it had happened. So the background of Torah, and especially when we get to Joshua and Judges and King David's story, quite literally should be seen as a post-apocalyptic background. Civilization literally collapsed at that time. The Bronze Age collapses in the background of Torah. So Egypt is one of the only civilizations that managed to survive this period. Mycenaeans, Hittites, Babylon, Neo-Babylon, etc. empires all collapsed under this period. Egypt also barely survived this. We also don't know what fully caused it, but it's likely climate change and a bunch of other factors. So we can see from tree and ice rings that there were some massive droughts and famines definitely in the Mediterranean area, and that intense food insecurity caused unstable conditions. Then revolts internally and wars for resources likely happened on a massive global scale. So that entire area was affected and more. So we also know that there were mass movements at this time because of the invading sea peoples, which were the Cretans and Mycenaeans. Also had a super volcano happen around that time. And these people, Egypt barely managed to repel from them conquering them. So this was a rough time. There were cutoffs of trade and trade routes from Afghanistan to Egypt, and travel and more became pretty much not impossible, but pretty darn hard. So, I mean, it became really hard, really nearly impossible, but, so Bronze Age collapse and more. The time between Joseph and Moses, there was world civilization, but at Moses' time, things are beginning to fall apart, or they were in the process of doing so. And by Judges, it's collapsed. So it's also very well recorded and known that Egypt would sometimes lose battles and give up vast amounts of territory, but then come back to Egypt and still declare themselves victorious. Examples, Egypt versus the Hittites, for example. So the idea that they would not erase, revise, and record things a certain way is actually very absurd. We see nations do this today. Did it happen? Yes. When? Unclear. We actually kind of see this with the U.S. today. So don't want to be too political here, but, U.S. and Vietnam, some other things like that. But many want the Pharaoh of Moses to also be Ramses III, since he was the one who repelled the sea peoples, but Ramses does not match so well historically. So what century and Pharaoh is Exodus under? We cannot definitively say where and what time period this is, but it is anywhere from the 16th to the 12th century BC. We can say that probably for certain. So, yeah. Now, lastly, I want to bring up the two powers of heaven doctrine. So, the two powers in heaven doctrine was a Jewish concept that later Jews labeled heretical by the rabbis after the 2nd century. And they recognized that while God is one, he often comes in some distinct ways. So the way he presents himself in the Old Testament when he comes to visit, to talk, to eat, etc., with figures in the Old Testament is the second power of heaven. And Christianity believes Jesus is the second power of heaven. So how did God, whom you're not supposed to be able to see and be able to live, if you do visit Abraham in Genesis? Well, this was through the second power of heaven. The Jews and those outside of Israel understood Yahweh to be one God and exist in three hypostases or persons in some way. So the second person or second power or second hypostasis came in this way to Abraham and others. And the second power Christianity believes is Jesus. The third is the Holy Spirit. Of note, this was the dominant position until Judaism reformed itself after 70 AD and tried to ban the second power doctrine as a heresy because of Jesus and Christianity and other sects of Judaism that would try and copy Christians. So, as Christians, we believe Abraham was and is talking to Jesus, the pre-incarnate Christ here. We also believe that Moses was in us talking to Jesus many times. So this we saw in Genesis, and it continues all throughout Torah. Exodus is no different. So anytime this happens in Exodus, I'm going to refer to this as a second power reference. So anywho, that is the end of this lesson today. And I know this was a very long one, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you'll watch the next ones that come up. We're going to do Exodus 1 and continue all through like we did last time for Genesis. So, anyways, thank you for listening. And if you like this podcast, hit like and subscribe so I can grow numbers and make more content for you. Anyways, thank you. God bless.